Hello, sports fans. This is Kevin Reichard welcoming you to an unusual chat. Normally, we're talking baseball, but today we're going to talk football with the impending launch of the NFL season and college football seasons. And I am joined today by three dignitaries from the football book world that I've had the considerable honor of publishing all three of them. And we're going to discuss football books today. We have Rick Gosselin, who is sort of, I think you're rightly now the dean of NFL football writers, wouldn't you say, Rick?
Oh, I'm one of them.
You're,
When you do it for 50 years, you automatically become a dean.
you're a dean. It's like everyone else is going to retire, and you're there's a lot to be said for last man standing, isn't there? And
Yes, sir.
He's more than just another dean.
Yeah, he's a must read if you're an NFL fan. We also have Tom Shanahan, who authored our Jimmy Ray book, Ray of Light, which is a great read. I would highly recommend it. And we have Jesse Goldberg-Strassler, who is our resident language source here with the Football Thesaurus. There's a little bit of honor here for both Jesse and Rick, and that we're coming out with new editions of their books. Rick's is Goodfellows, which details the mighty St. Ambrose football program in Detroit. Another great read. And I think that with the release of the third edition of that, Rick, let's go over that book a little bit first, discuss it, because if people have not read it, I would highly recommend it just because it's so elegantly written and tells such a great story.
Yeah, there's a couple things different in this book. I've got another Hall of Famer right in the introduction. I've got two Hall of Famers now, forward introduction, Tony Dungy and Joe DeLamielleure. Joe DeLamielleure is a new addition, and he played against St. Ambrose in basketball and was on the east side of Detroit. He was well aware of St. Ambrose and was. I went to St. Ambrose, and Joe was concurrent with me at St. Clement. So he was, and he told me it's his favorite book. He reads it a couple times a year. So I gave him a chance to get his name in there, and he jumped at it. So yeah, it's a really good story. It's about a high school football team, a small high school football team, Catholic school, east side of Detroit, 360 kids in the school, half of them girls. And this little school had two coaches that went on to win 6 Super Bowl rings. The school won 5 city titles, 4 state titles in a span of 8 years. Just an amazing story. And I've gotten a lot of feedback from high school coaches from around the country that have read it and said it's very inspirational how you can do it with the tool that you have. St. Ambrose didn't have a practice field. They didn't have a home field. Their locker room was in a carved out coal bin in the basement of the school. At one point, all 12 grades were in the one building. And yet this school went on to produce NFL players and NFL coaches and win titles, and just a great story. And then demise, their last city coach championship was 67. By 1971, the team did not win a game, did not score a point, and the school folded. So it's a great story. And reading through the book, a lot of the names are familiar to people that are not from Detroit, not from Michigan, do not know St. Ambrose. Coaches whose names came up, George Perlis, Tom Boister, were both coaches at St. Ambrose. Perlis won 4 Super Bowl rings as defense coordinator of the Steelers. Boister won 2 as a personnel director of the New York Giants. He's the guy that drafted Lawrence Taylor and Phil Simms and Joe Morris and Carl Banks and those great players. Perlis, of course, went on to coach at Michigan State and won a Rose Bowl at Michigan State. Other coaches named in the book, Lloyd Carr, head coach at Michigan. Chuck Fairbanks, who had the dynasty at Oklahoma. Jerry Burns, who became the head coach at the Minnesota Vikings. Those names are in the book. Dave DeBuscher, Hall of Fame basketball player, he turns up in the book. Dave Bonnier, who used to be the House Whip, Democratic House Whip in Congress, he's in the book. Tom Beer, who went to St. Ambrose, played in the NFL. Gary Nowak, St. Ambrose, played in the NFL with the Chargers. Dan Curry is in the book. He was a linebacker on Lombardi's championship teams in the 60s. Gary Danielson is in the book. He of course played at Purdue and a lengthy career in the NFL. Now is a commentator for the SEC games. Tom Paciorek, great baseball player, was in the book. Just a lot of names are weaved into the narrative. And I talk about the premise of the book was based on one game, the 1959 Goodfellow game, where St. Ambrose was a heavy underdog, probably a 14 or 17 point underdog by today's numbers, playing against the best public school in the state, #1 team with 3,600 students. And St. Ambrose beat this bigger, stronger team on a touchdown on a 4th down run and win the closing seconds of the game. So again, it's a great story. People that have read it, I've gotten a lot of feedback from across the country. People, especially high school coaches, that have enjoyed it. And because I went there, I'm probably the only person that could have written that story. And when I was doing my NFL duties, I'd go through the Steeler camp and the Giants camp. I have dinner with Perlis and Boyster, and they told me for years, you got to write a book. This is such an amazing story. You got to write a book. So I wrote a book.
And it's, as I noted, it's in its 3rd edition now. Will be
Very
coming
proud
out.
of that, by the way. Very proud of that.
You should be. It's a great book. I mean, I will be selfish here and say I'm really proud to have published it, because it tells a great story, and it's very inspirational too. You know, I can see why high school coaches would love to be reading it. So the book came out, and you've heard from a lot of high school coaches since. And what about some of the players involved?
Oh, it's been amazing. I'm still in contact. The book came out in 2009. And the reason that came out in 2009, that was the 50th anniversary of that 1959 Goodfellow game. And we had, I had a book signing at Barnes & Noble, which it had a good turnout. And then we had a book signing at St. Ambrose in the basement in the Ark. Myself and Tom Boyster, who has since passed away, were signing it. And the line was out the street. We probably signed 300 and some books. I had writer's cramp at the end of the day. And they had a big banquet. But they brought all the players back from all the teams, all the coaches. And it was just a fantastic night, because again, the school's gone. And a lot of these guys, this is the greatest memories of their life. And to get together and talk about it and get George Perlis and Tom Boyster and Joe Carruthers, another coach there, get them all back, and the stars, the Joe D'Angelos, the Mike Van Gothams, and the Tom Beers, just the great players, the great stories. And I've had a number of players that I could not reach have since reached out to me and said, boy, I wish I could have talked to you. A couple guys that they never returned the call, told me later, that's such a great book. I wish I could have talked to you. I wish I could have got my name in that book. So yeah, it's been widely received, and it's been what, 12, 13 years, and it still sells copies. And I put a plug out every high school football season saying, here's a great high school book, and it sells good copies in September for that reason. And I've got a lot of coaches from Texas high schools, which is as good a high school football as you're going to get, who have read the book. So, it's very inspirational. And it tells you what hard work ethic, getting the right players, the right attitude, the right character, you can win championships. So it's been a very gratifying experience. And I always said, if I was going to write a book, I had a chance to write books with NFL people. But I said, if I'm going to write a book, I want to have my name on it, and it's got to be something I care about. And having grown up in this parish, attending this school, knowing these people, this is a book I cared about. And this is the one I wrote.
Now we're seeing a theme here for those sharp-eyed, because every one of these writers are Michigan roots. Between Rick growing up there, between Tom's book, which we'll discuss next, and then Jesse's the voice of the Lansing Lugnut. So and I don't know how that happened exactly, because I'm in Minnesota and Wisconsin, but Michigan rules, I guess. So we'll shout out.
That's where all the great writers are.
Yes, that's correct. We'll go. That'll work. And keeping on the Michigan theme, Tom Shanahan, your book on Ray of Light, detailing Jimmy Ray's journey from the South to Michigan State, and that whole Duffy Doherty Pipeline, similarly, it's a book I'm very proud to have published because it tells a great story. I absolutely love Jimmy Ray. I think he's, done great things with his life. And why don't you talk about your book a little bit too now?
Yeah, well, the best thing about Rick's book is when I was looking for a publisher, Rick and I crossed paths at a Michigan State Communications and Arts session where we met with a lot of students. A lot of alumni came back for the students, and expressed my frustration to Lynn Henning that I couldn't find a publisher. And he directed me to Rick, and Rick directed me to you. And I don't know if I would ever, since I'm not a nationally known writer, I don't know if I would ever found a publisher. It's such a tough business.
Probably not.
So
Probably not.
yeah, yeah,
Publishers don't like to look at these sort of projects. I love these projects personally, because I love the quality. I love the stories,
yeah.
and
It,
you
it,
know,
it, if you're not well known, but even John Feinstein has said he had trouble convincing the publishers to go with his Bobby Knight book.
yeah.
A season on the break, he couldn't find a publisher at first. But anyways, on my book, I had grown up in Michigan in Big Rapids, which is the home of Fair State University, which is a Division II football power. And it was a great town to grow up in. And my dad was a professor there. We moved from Cleveland when I was in elementary school in 1964. So, well, the Spartans had their great teams in 65 and 66. So I was immediately a Michigan State fan. And it was the only school I applied to. Once I was accepted, I didn't bother applying anywhere else. And I've always loved history. So I knew there was something special about Michigan State's team because they had so many black players and they had a black quarterback. But I was just a kid and couldn't really articulate it intellectually. But because I love history, it always stayed in the back of my mind. And then as my sports writing career got later into life, in my sports writing career, I got to meet Jimmy Ray's son. I was working in San Diego, and Jimmy Ray's son was then vice president with the Chargers. He's been with some NFL teams since then. And I mentioned to Jimmy that Jimmy Jr., Jimmy the Third, actually, that I don't think the Underground Railroad story has ever properly been told. And asked him if he could hook me up with his dad. And that was the great part about it, is he's got Bubba Smith had recently died. And so these guys realized their story was fading into history and it needed to be told. So not only was I able to focus on Jimmy Ray, George Webster was the greatest Spartan, but he'd passed away. Bubba Smith is the most famous Spartan, but he'd passed away. But Jimmy Ray is the most socially significant as a black quarterback in the 60s, and then as a pioneer black coach in college, hired by Duffy Daugherty, and then on into the NFL for a long time, was with Rick in Kansas City for a long time. And so Jimmy was eager to do the story as well. And then there was no trouble tracking down the Michigan State players. They wanted the story told too. But the thing that fascinated me the most as I got into my research and burrowed into the archives at Michigan State is I had grown up a Michigan State fan and heard all these rumors and myths about Bear Bryant sending Duffy Daugherty players. And I started to realize, wait a minute, none of this stuff adds up. Bear Bryant says on film in the 60s that he couldn't find any black athletes that were qualified to go to Alabama. Well, wait a minute. How could you be sending Bubba Smith to Duffy Daugherty when Duffy Daugherty had to reject Joe Namath because Michigan State told him there was no way he was getting admitted? But Joe Namath, after he was denied admission at Maryland, got admitted the very next day at Alabama. So, and then the other thing was I wanted to identify exactly what was the Underground Railroad. You know about the 7 all Big Ten, all American stars. Well, nobody in college football recruiting goes 7 for 7. So I knew there had to be more players. What I didn't know was there were 44 from 10 of the 13 southern states, not a single one of them from Alabama. That's when I started getting suspicious, because back then recruiting isn't as sophisticated as it is now. You knew what was in your backyard and maybe from a word of mouth. And then the most famous story is, in fact, it's the only one. People give credit, but Bear Bryant credit for sending Duffy players, but there's no record of him ever sending him a player. The only one that's talked about is Charlie Thornhill. And that's Duffy's fault, because Duffy made a joke about him and Bear trading Joe Namath and Charlie Thornhill. Well, Joe Namath was 2 years ahead of Charlie Thornhill. And I later spoke to, Charlie's passed away. I later spoke to Charlie's younger brother, Nay Thornhill, who was at the banquet in Roanoke, Virginia, where Charlie met Bear Bryant. And then also spoke to Charlie's son, Caleb, who was with the Miami Dolphins at the time in their front office. And Charlie's younger brother said, and I figured this out from my research too, Charlie had already been in the paper. Charlie had already committed to Michigan State before he ever met Bear Bryant. I asked Nay about it, his younger brother, and they said the only thing Bear Bryant ever said to Charlie was, "You enjoy playing for Duffy." And then when I talked to Caleb Thornhill, he said his dad never once mentioned Bear Bryant's role in his college career at Michigan State. So I just felt that Duffy Daugherty is the true story of college football integration, his players, and the doors that he opened it up. Other Southern schools started following his example, all ahead of Bear Bryant. Bear Bryant didn't have a black player until 1971. That's a long time after the school was desegregated in 1963. So I've not only tried to tell the story of all these guys, how they ended up at Michigan State, how they had success they think they wouldn't have had elsewhere, but also that I've tried to make the point out more so on my website nowadays that Bear Bryant and all these players have been, Duffy Daugherty and all these players have been overshadowed by myths and outright fiction enshrouding the 1970 USC-Alabama game that has reduced Duffy to a footnote. Duffy and his players, Duffy and the Southern black coaches, such as Bubba Smith's son, who was the chief engineer of the Underground Railroad, they've been reduced to footnotes, and they're the real pioneers. And so that's kind of where I'm at. I don't know, we haven't mentioned this yet, but I've come across a lot of new research about Duffy and his assistant coaches. And I'm going to be sending you stuff, Jesse, on a second book about Michigan State's pioneering role. And I'll say this too, when my book first came out, I got a lot of pushback from Alabama and USC fans when I tried to point out all the myths and fiction. I don't get as much as I used to. I think a lot of people are starting to realize it, but nobody wants to take on Bear Bryant. So you won't see anything in national publications. I thought I had an ally with the undefeated ESPN, told them all about my idea, about this story I was putting together on myths and fiction. And same with, what's that alternative website that used to be real popular it broke the Manti Te'o story.
Deadspin.
Deadspin. And the editors told me, yeah, we think Bear Bryant gets too much credit, but they didn't use my story. I think they're all afraid to take on Alabama and USC fans.
Yeah, there was a lack of interest among Southern media in this book. I did a lot of reaching out and not interested, which I just found fascinating because, the irony is that the sort of conflict that you describe sells eyeballs, and they were too scared to take on the sacred cows, and to be fair, in a way, I mean, Alabama newspapering is a pittance of what it was, to be totally honest. Because another author that Jesse knows has been laid off there several years ago, just financial reasons. Mark McCarter's talented, award-winning dude, but the sports departments and all these Alabama newspapers have been decimated to nothing. So basically, you have one newspaper now covering the whole state.
Well, the other side of that is Michigan State University itself has failed to tell Duffy's story. They don't the school itself does not understand the magnitude of what Duffy did. Now that might be changing with Mel Tucker, because Mel wants his players to know the history of the 1960s teams and these players. And they're starting to make strides in that direction to teach the kids. I often tell this example, Andrew Marinus wrote a book called strong inside on Perry Wallace, the first black basketball player in the SEC at Vanderbilt. And Andrew's a Vanderbilt grad. And his father's David Meredith, the Pulitzer Prize winner. And Vanderbilt has taken his book and made it required reading among their freshmen. They've also set up 2 scholarships, not by outside parties. The university is driving it because they want their students to learn the history of Vanderbilt's role in ending segregation in the South and how they should have acted sooner. Now, that's a tough thing to do at Michigan State. It's a large private public school. You can't do the same thing. But I think the school needs to take on that attitude because I doubt President Stanley at Michigan State or the 2, 3, 4, 5 presidents before them could tell you anything more than that Bubba Smith was a great player from the South.
Yeah. So, but let me turn something back a little bit. Tell us more about Jimmy himself. Because I think, you touched on a lot of broad institutional stuff, but there's also the great story about Jimmy himself, confronting, obstacles every step of the way.
Well, Jimmy played at Fayetteville E.E. Smith High, and it was a segregated school. And back then, he knew Michigan State was a place for him to have an opportunity. And once Cal Stoll was the Michigan State assistant at the time that recruited him, Duffy was a little bit hesitant to take him at first, but then Cal Stoll came down to the black North Carolina black All-Star game because it was segregation. Jimmy had a great game on his recruiting trip to Michigan State. Duffy was still a little bit hesitant. On his recruiting trip to Michigan State, Vince Carolan, who was an assistant coach, had Jimmy throw some passes and study his arm, all stuff you're not allowed to do nowadays in recruiting. And he told Duffy, don't worry about his arm. So Jimmy finally got his scholarship offer. He went to Michigan State. One of the first things he saw as a young freshman was a portrait of Gideon Smith in Jennison Fieldhouse. And Gideon Smith was Michigan State's first black athlete in 1913 to 1915, I believe it was. And he saw Gideon Smith and he said, well, if he can do it in 1913, I can do it in the 1960s. So he went through a lot of frustration. Freshmen weren't eligible for the varsity in those days. Here's an ironic story about that has a lot to do with his success at Michigan State. Is he was in a pretty wide open offense in high school, and Duffy, of course, ran a 3-back offense, and he had to relearn his footwork. He had trouble with it first as a freshman, but one of the quarterback so Jimmy arrives as a freshman in '64. The quarterback in '63, help me out here, Rick. I'm drawing a blank. Dick Probostol was the quarterback in '63, and he had suffered concussions in high school, and then he suffered in Michigan State, and then he had a bad one in spring of '63, spring football, and the doctors told Duffy he can't play football anymore. But Duffy invited him to come out and work with the freshman team, sort of an unofficial coach, and Jimmy Ray credited Dick Probostol for teaching him the offense, and that had a lot to do with his success at Michigan State. He was behind an All-American his first year, Steve Juday, and then he was a starter in '66 and '67. There were only 2 black quarterbacks in the nation in '66 when the Spartans played Notre Dame in the game of the century. The other was Gene Washington, not Michigan State's Gene Washington, at Stanford, but he was switched to wide receiver as a junior. And as I started doing, this is another thing that people don't understand the magnitude of Michigan State's story. Everybody knows that Sandy Stevens was the first black quarterback to win a national title in Minnesota in 1960. And I started thinking, well, wait a minute, if Jimmy wins a national title at Michigan State, there are no black quarterbacks in college football. That makes him the South's first black quarterback to win a national title. And nobody had ever brought that up, mentioned it or anything. I ran it by Jimmy, and even he was surprised. I ran it by the National Football Foundation and College Football Hall of Fame. and they agreed with me, and so that's part of the book. So Jimmy was a pioneer as a player. He was a very determined person, and he planned to be a lawyer until he played a couple years in the NFL, broke his arm really badly with the Rams, um, and then he came back to school to finish up his degree and was thinking about being a lawyer. And Duffy offered him a part-time job breaking down film, and then the next year he hired him as an assistant coach. And then he was off on his way as both a college and NFL pioneer. He's one of the first coordinators in the NFL as an offensive coordinator with the Rams. John Robinson hired him in 1983. And a story John Robinson told me, I said, this is 1983. You don't have all these computers printing out analytics back then. He said the reason they were mostly a college staff, they had come from USC. And he said that what I liked about Jimmy is he just had a photographic memory. Whoever we were playing, he could call up in his mind what plays worked against that coach in the past, and it just helped with game planning, and he became the offensive coordinator.
Yeah, Jimmy's led a great life. Pioneer, still does charity work, still does camps, although I don't know if in COVID if he's been doing them, but still does his charity stuff in South Carolina. Again, a great story, and Tom told it really well. It's a great read, great book.
Yeah, one more thing. I recently posted a video about Jimmy on my website, and
tell everyone
Jim
the
Trotter,
URL, Tom. Huh? Tell everyone the URL.
Tom Shanahan .report. You don't have to put the com on there for something about the way the site was made. If you do put the com on there, it might take you somewhere else. So just Tom Shanahan .report, and right at the top, look for Duffy Daugherty's Michigan State milestone minutes. And the latest one I did was on Jimmy, on how he was the most socially significant. I'd earlier done them on Bubba and George Webster. And Jim Trotter, another NFL dean, retweeted it, and he also put in the message, Jimmy Ray is one of the most unappreciated treasures in football, because he didn't get a chance to be a head coach, and because his time was in the 80s. It's a disgrace that Michigan State didn't hire either Sherman Lewis or Jimmy Ray as a head coach when there were job openings that they wanted. And I appreciate it, Jim Trotter adding his insight that Duffy's never gotten his true credit. What I was going to add was, and I say this in the video, I don't understand why the Big Ten Network and the NFL Network both haven't done a story on Jimmy Ray and Sherman Lewis as pioneer coaches in college hired by Duffy Daugherty. And then they had great NFL careers, deserved to be a head coach, but they were denied their chance because of racism. And but if you watch the Big Ten Network and the NFL Network, you'd think the only successful Black coaches in the history of college and pro football were Tony Dungy and Dennis Green. So this is a story waiting to be told on a far bigger audience than me, because I'm still looking for that tripwire. I haven't found it yet, but I'm going to keep looking.
Yeah, that's something that I'm certainly looking forward to as well. And then last but certainly not least is Jesse Goldberg-Strassler and the Football Thesaurus, which is coming out with second edition, new edition as well. The cover is stunning. I'm just so happy about that, because our friends at ABC dug through the archives for some first season Monday Night Football stills with Dandy Don and crew, and the cover's really cool, and we'll be unveiling it next week. So Jesse, how you doing?
I'm good. It's an honor to be here with Rick and with Tom and Kevin. Thank you. I'd reached out to Rick at one point because I was asked to pinch hit for hosting a Lansing area sports talk show, and then George Perlis passed away. So suddenly that entire show turned into a tribute show to George, bringing on person after person after person to talk about what he meant and his legacy and who he was. So that was the last time I remember reaching out to you, Rick. So this is a privilege to share this panel with the two of you. The Football Thesaurus begins, I guess, with the way that I see myself as a broadcaster is that I see it as a translator at the United Nations, that everybody who's watching cares to know what is being said. And the game that takes place is the speaker up there at the dais. And so the translation needs to happen, and the translation should be accurate. And it's all about the search for what words should be used. And so I grew up watching as much football as I could. Same thing, baseball, basketball, soccer, hockey, whatever sport is in season. But football gets my heart palpitating. And I read as much as I possibly could. And then entering the field of broadcasting and then writing about it, it is really all about trying to use that accurate language to describe what we see, to bring that visual into words. And whether that's live into somebody listening in on the radio or watching on TV, or then reading about it after the fact. So yes, and it begins as a thesaurus. That's why it's so important that it's the Football Thesaurus, is what are the different ways that we can use to describe what is actually taking place on the field, from the formations to the plays. And then if you get into what is happening, you have to get into why and how offenses and defenses have evolved, which led me into filling my closet with book upon book and reading old newspaper upon newspaper and listening into current broadcasts and past broadcasts and sitting down and talking with everyone that I possibly could. And that's my biggest imposter syndrome of it all, is that it by nature is limited, because I'm not going to talk to everyone to try to get all the language that I can, but it is a meager attempt to chronicle how we describe the game of football.
And you know, football language, and all three of you know this, it's incredibly arcane. You know, it's you learn by repetition, and then there's just some inexplicable whimsiness in it all, like Omaha. So it's a fun sport to watch, to listen to. What is Jesse, as Jesse's books, they're billed as thesauruses, but they're sort of they go beyond that, and that they include a lot of stories of how the phrases came to be. And what are some of your favorite stories in the Football Thesaurus?
I think the reason that's why is those were my favorite books while growing up, or those books that just tossed in the anecdote here or there that made you lean a little bit closer to the book, or made you stop and say, I need to share this with somebody else as soon as possible. This can't just stop with me reading this story. So yes, reading about the famed, let's say, offensive lines or defensive lines, being able to share the tales about the 7 blocks of granite, for example, of Fordham University, or the understanding of how we came to today's penalty flag, and that it began as an air horn, and how the very first flag was sewed into existence and then introduced into football itself. That, I think, is what really stands out to me, is how we got to where we are.
Yeah, it's a fascinating journey, between the evolution of the football itself to how George Halas used to phrase the football, phrasing about the football.
Let me throw
I think,
another one at you real quick, Kevin, is the idea of the gridiron.
yeah,
And why is the football field called the gridiron? And tracing it back to a kid's book about how it's the metaphor of being under pressure and being under heat. And that idea of the heat that the game puts you under, that kind of pressure being translated into the field itself tests you. And we're going to extend that metaphor into the field itself being forever nicknamed hereafter the gridiron.
yeah, and some of the anecdotes are really just so cute in a way, like why there's the specific number of hash marks in the end zones of Notre Dame, for instance. That very specific meaning.
I think that's important. I think that when you specify and when you personalize, because language is generally personalized by the person, and one person can coin terms and bring it forward, whether it's as we look at the cover of the book, and whether it's a Dandy Don, or whether it's a Cosell, whether it's that local broadcaster who suddenly serves as the voice for the entire region. And the same thing goes for schools. The same things go for professional teams, where it starts locally and it starts with that player, that coach, that fan base, and then it explodes out from there.
Or PR people including phrases.
Yes. I mean, I think about Gene Deckerhoff, where every single completion is a caught ball, and just him shouting "caught ball" anytime the ball is caught. And I can't get that out of my memory.
Yeah, and maybe this is me. Sometimes I don't think football treats its history very well in terms of this colorful stuff. Baseball's, I think, much better at it, and I'm not quite sure why.
I think that there's two sides of the coin, in that football is so constantly moving forward and the game changing that it's very easy to look back upon 10, 15, 20 years ago and say, this is a different game. When the players playing now are playing a very different game than the one being played if you go back 30, 40 years. Today's young fans growing up would wonder, what is this? Where's for example, as we now see the spread offenses, that's the easiest thing. But there was a time not all that long ago where a quarterback entering the NFL had to be able to take all of his snaps under center. And we would criticize a player who could only take snaps out of the shotgun or the pistol. And the pistol wasn't even something that existed. And now we look at football, and yes, you can just bring a quarterback into the league and all of his snaps can be in shotgun. Things have changed that quickly. And so to be able to change from the days of a Sammy Baugh, to be able to look back upon those incredible University of Michigan passing attacks when nobody passed the ball, to be able to look back upon Fielding Yost, or to be able to quote a John Heisman. Whereas with baseball, here's the flip of the coin. Today's game is so largely criticized by the older heads. And there was just a segment on MLB Network where it was Billy Ripken trying to say, actually, pitchers have always thrown the ball just as hard as they're throwing it now. I think that both of those can learn from each other. That football, we can pay a lot more respect to where the game has come from and understood what the game was like. And not just look back at it and say, the game back then was more vicious, and stop there. Because we have to understand, and this is where, back to the words, where do our blitz schemes come from? Where does the bare front come from? And all of this more. The same thing comes from baseball. When people are talking today about spin rate, they're describing a hopping fastball, the same that was thrown in the 1950s, or that Hugh Casey featured for the Brooklyn Dodgers. It's just a different term for something that has existed. So that's something that I enjoy, is what are we calling things and what were they called and how do we tie them all together?
Kevin, let me jump in here a second. Talking about August publications, I found Kevin, Jeff Carson wrote a book called Homer on a high school baseball team in Michigan, set a national record.
Yes.
That's how I found Kevin, because I had, like Tom, I had difficulty chopping my book, but the Homer book planted that seed. Jesse, how did you find August publications?
Rick, good question. And by the way, I helped run the Michigan Baseball Hall of Fame in Lansing. And so we inducted the Homer baseball team in. And so Scott Sallow and all of his coaches, and one of the best things is all of the players that had compiled that winning streak marching across the field to throw out the ceremonial first pitch, and all of the mothers for the players clambering onto the dugout to take pictures as they're shouting at the security guards, "You can't stop us, we're the moms." So great. Oh, the Homer baseball team. Oh, man.
That is a great book. And that should also be pushed. It's a fabulous book.
Yes.
Fabulous story.
Yeah.
So Rick, to answer your question, I had created my lists, my initial thesaurus lists for all of these sports. Joe Davis, now with the Dodgers, was working with me and starting to create basketball lists. And we had football list and baseball list. And I was sharing them with broadcaster upon broadcaster. And somebody suggested that I should find a literary agent and I should get it published. So I wrote a query, and a literary agent out of New York said, "I love this. This is great for the baseball thesaurus," the initial proposal. And so I worked with him for a full year to build it up, flesh it up, find an illustrator. And after a full year, he said, "I love it. I've talked to publishers. Nobody wants it. Good luck, kid." And
we've all been there.
The glamorous world of publishing.
So then I started sharing it with other people, seeing where could I go from here. And Kevin, you were those people. You were one of those people that I emailed it to.
Yeah. Do you remember when we first met, Jesse?
We met at the winter meetings months after I had been named an honorable mention for a Ballpark Digest Broadcaster of the Year. And I wanted to seek you out to say thank you. I'd never heard of Ballpark Digest before. What an incredible honor.
Yeah. And it was for your recreation game, as I recall, wasn't it?
Yes, it was 2008.
Yes. A little background. Jesse does an annual recreation game like the broadcasters of the past, like in Bull Durham, where the team was on the road, the broadcaster would stay in the studio and recreate from a ticker tape, which isn't that old, really. I didn't know this. Vin Scully did that during his Dodgers days. Dodgers didn't always send him on the road when they were in Brooklyn, interestingly enough. So he did recreation games for a couple of years.
Well, unfortunately, now we have broadcasters in the major leagues not being sent out, just like the minors. So I sent all of my canned crowd sound and everything else. It's now at every single level of the majors, at minors, with people using Lansing Lugnuts fans reacting. But yeah, I would like us to get back to the days where broadcasters travel.
Yeah. And gosh, I hope so. I feel really sorry for some of these broadcasters. But to get back to football, you know, publishing these books has been such a great privilege for me, I got to say. And I so want to do more. So keep the word out. I think football is kind of underserved in the publishing world. I mean, you've got baseball is a hard market because you've got between all the mainstream publishers doing nostalgia books, you've got Saber doing quite a bit of good publishing on its own. There's no football equivalent of Saber to that anyway, to its size. So there's my plea. I would love to be publishing more. Tom's working on another book, which I'm really excited about. And I think you could break some real ground there, Tom.
And also, you know, you've been looking into making a YA edition.
Yeah,
And
we've been
I've
talking
actually got a Michigan State grad who's in Columbus, Ohio, actually, that has used Rayalite as part of his civil rights lessons with kids. And he's found that the kids really find it fast. Not only do the kids find it fascinating, but he's had dads that are Ohio State fans that have called him up and said, "Yeah, I've been looking at this book. I didn't know any of this stuff." And we're going to start up something where we do Zoom calls. You know, hopefully I can get Jimmy and some of the players on there, and these kids can ask questions about segregation and going to Michigan State, because kids today, black and white, they think segregation is ancient history. It's recent history. These guys are still walking around. And then the other thing, again, and it's in my search for that tripwire, is I got a children's book coming out. It should be coming out soon. They originally talked about July, but you know how that is. And it's the title. This is going to emphasize the Southern Black high school coaches sending players to Duffy, because this is what people don't understand. They think Duffy just got lucky with a couple of players. Oh, mom told him about Bubba Smith. That's not what it was. All the black coaches in the South already respected Michigan State for their 1954 and 56 Rose Bowl teams for the number of black stars they had, including Leroy Bolden as a black captain. And so Michigan State had a reputation to begin with in the 50s. And then Duffy spoke at a clinic in the South in Atlanta. Hank Bullitt told me this story. And when Duffy got there, he learned the black high school coaches weren't being admitted. They were denied entry. And he was so upset about that, he put on a clinic on his own for the black high school coaches. So now the coaches not only knew Michigan State's history, they knew Duffy Doherty as this great guy, and they started sending him players. And then the chief engineer was Bubba's father, Willie Ray Smith, a legendary Texas high school coach. Coached 33 years in segregated Texas, won 235 games, 2 black state titles. So in this children's book, Bubba and his dad get on the train in Beaumont, Texas, Houston, and they start weaving their way through the South, picking up players until they get up to East Lansing.
Amazing. And that was not that long ago.
No.
So these kids really do need to learn what happened in our not so recent past. On that note, and let's wrap up. Any parting thoughts, gentlemen?
Keep
I
reading.
guess
Keep reading. Reading's good.
Reading is good. Reading is very good. And on that note, I will say thank you to each one of you. I know Jesse's in the middle of his season, so he's been working hard. And Rick, you're getting ready for training camp starting, and
I'll be in Canton next week for the Hall of Fame.
that's right, Hall of Fame coming up. Isn't that amazing? It just seems a little early to me, but football season always creeps up on you, doesn't it?
Yeah, they're playing a game
For
on
the rest
Thursday.
of us. It's your
Yeah, they're
job.
playing a game Thursday.
Wow. And Tom, thanks so much. Looking forward to your next book and the revelations you'll have for us undoubtedly.
Thank you.
So
We'll keep looking for that tripwire. It's out there.
it's out there. You'll find it. You'll find it. And on that note, thanks to you, our devoted viewers for spending this time with us. We appreciate it. For these three esteemed writers, this is Kevin Reichard saying goodbye and thank you so much.